Hello, welcome to the Pauper Metagame. I'm your host, MSP, or Making Smart Plays, which is my screen name on Magic Online. Not because I make smart plays, but hey, it's aspirational. We should all at least try, right? And what I want to do today is just give you a little introduction to this channel, the Pauper Metagame, and the goal of the channel, which is to give you a one-stop shop to check out different decks, get a concise overview of the deck, and then find out how that deck is doing in the meta and find out some of the key interactions in that deck and some of the things to keep in mind in different matchups. Let's go ahead and jump right in today, and I want to start out with Elves. It's one of the top decks, and this particular video is going to be about Elves. So here we see, according to MTG Goldfish, it's saying it has about 9% of the metagame. So this is one of the top decks. It's a tier 1 deck. You know, MTG Goldfish's numbers may not be exactly correct, but it's definitely a tier 1 deck. Let's talk about what's going on with Elves. Right now, Elves is in an interesting space because Lead the Stampede just became a common in Iconic Masters. Lead the Stampede is a card that lets you look at your top 5 cards and then grab any creatures that you find there and put them in your hand. When you look at a deck like Elves, this is a stock list that runs 9 forests and also only runs 10 sorceries and 1 artifact, along with 40 creatures. So when 2/3 of your deck are creatures, there's a reasonable chance that when you pop Lead the Stampede, you might have a reasonable chance to hit 2, 3, maybe even 4 creatures, which is a nice reload for a deck like Elves that can play its hand out fairly quickly. One of the things to point out about Elves right now is that Distant Melody and Lead the Stampede are fulfilling the same role. Basically, they're both there to help draw cards. And right now, with the introduction of Lead the Stampede, there's certainly a lot of experimentation to figure out what the right mix is between Lead the Stampede and Distant Melody. But before we get more to that, let's just talk about the deck as a whole. The whole goal behind Elves is to be a synergistic, aggressive deck. What the deck wants to do is to play Elves like Fyndhorn Elves, which create mana, Llanowar Elves, which create mana, Birchlore Rangers, which allow you to tap 2 untapped Elves you control and add 1 mana of any mana to your mana pool, which allows you to accelerate the deployment of your Elves by tapping Elves that might otherwise have Summoning Sickness to add mana to your mana pool, and also this allows you to create blue mana if you're running Distant Melody. Additionally, in addition to the various mana elves that are included in the deck, there's also the synergy between Nettle Sentinel and Birchlore Rangers. By tapping your Birchlore Rangers and your Nettle Sentinel to cast another elf, when the Nettle Sentinel untaps, because it untaps when another green creature comes into play, you'll now have the Nettle Sentinel available to tap again with the Birchlore Ranger and any other elf you deploy. Interestingly enough, while this is fairly good, one of the sidebar comments I would say is pretty much all the stock lists out there run Nettle Sentinel. One of the things I'm a little bit curious about is if Distant Melody is dropped from some lists, if those deck lists might even experiment with dropping Birchlore Rangers and Nettle Sentinel if anything else more powerful or interesting comes out in the future. But for the time being, most deck lists do tend to run Nettle Sentinel and Birchlore Rangers, even if they don't have any Distant Melodies, just because of Birchlore Ranger's ability to power out extra elves, and the deck definitely wants to get on the board quickly. Some of the more powerful effects in the deck include Elvish Vanguard, which gets a +1/+1 counter anytime you play an elf, along with Well-Wisher, which gains you a life for each elf in play, Timberwatch Elf, which allows you to pump any elf on your side, or even the opponent's side, I guess if you wanted to get +X/+X, where X is the number of elves in play. So if you have 10 elves, Timberwatch Elf will give one of your elves +10/+10. Liss Alana Huntmaster basically creates a 1/1 elf token for you anytime you play an elf. The interesting thing about this card is it says whenever you cast an elf spell, you get a token. So even if they counterspell your elf spell, you still get the token. It's not a come into play trigger. So that's kind of nice. You'll find a fair amount of these lists that run land grant to allow you to deck thin out more lands. And this is helpful just to avoid drawing lands. It's also useful in terms of helping lead the Stampede be more consistent, because at any given point in the game, the less land you have in your deck, the more likely you are to hit creatures with your Lead the Stampede. We also have Viridian Longbow, which synergizes nicely with Elves that tap and untap. If you put a Viridian Longbow on a Nettle Sentinel, you can cast multiple Elves and allow Nettle Sentinel to ping repeatedly. It's also worth pointing out that Quirion Ranger synergizes with any tap effect in your deck, because Quirion Ranger allows you to untap an elf by simply bouncing a forest back to your hand. This means if on your first turn you deploy a forest and play a Llanowar elf, and on your second turn you play a Quirion Ranger, even if you don't have any other lands, you're going to still have the ability to tap your forest, return it to your hand, tap it again, and tap your mana elf twice, giving you access to up to 4 mana on your second turn. -1 if you count the deployment of the Quirion Ranger itself. So that's pretty handy. More potently, being able to tap a Well-Wisher or a Timberwatch elf, or get extra activations out of a Viridian Longbow, these are all potent effects. We only run anywhere from 8 to 12 forests in the deck, maybe 13 on the heavy side, just because you have the extra mana elves and you really don't want to flood out. And also, again, Lead the Stampede really wants a high creature concentration. As far as the sideboard goes, Essence Warden, and some people also run some of these in the main, allows you to get a little extra life gain off of your creatures and also off of opponents' creatures. This is devastating against an opponent's token deck that might not have a way to deal with Essence Warden. Relic of Progenitus is a catch-all against graveyard strategies, as it allows you the ability to exile all cards in all graveyards. And Gleeful Sabotage is extremely good against Affinity. It allows you to kill artifact creatures and artifact lands. Additionally, Gleeful Sabotage is also really good against Boggles, or the hexproof deck that takes hexproof creatures and pumps them up with buff effects. And Gleeful Sabotage allows you to pinpoint and destroy some of the most powerful enchantments, and this can often be good enough to give you a chance to win the game. Mob Justice is particularly good in situations where your opponent, maybe they're playing some kind of heavy fog deck, and maybe if you get an opening where you know they can't counterspell, you can use Mob Justice to finish off the game even if you can't get combat damage through. Mob Justice can also be a strong finisher against a control deck that maybe doesn't have a lot of counterspells, or perhaps you're in some kind of a matchup where you know the board state is going to stall out on both sides, and you can use Mob Justice to go over the top for the win. Moment's Peace is particularly good against all-in combo decks. Anything like Is It Blitz, or basically white-blue combo. Anything that's going to try to alpha strike you in one hit, Moment's Peace can be very good. An ATOG that is pumped up with Temur Battle Rage. Any of these kind of things, Moment's Peace can be enough to win the game all by itself sometimes in the right situation, when your opponent uses all their resources to alpha strike you in one hit. Also, maybe just in a fighting against another aggro deck, this gives you a chance to get that to basically stop one opponent's combat, give you the tempo to win the game. We already talked about Well-Wisher. Luminescent Rain is just in play strictly for the burn matchup. If your opponent kills your Well-Wishers and your Essence Wardens, even though it may seem like you have a fair bit of life gain in your deck, because these creatures have to stick around long enough to do much, if burn kills them as soon as they come down, you can actually have a little bit of an issue keeping up with burn. Luminescent Rain is good because typically you'll be able to have a fair amount of creatures out, and getting this off should get you the win against a burn deck. Spider Silk Armor is there because there's a whole lot of decks out there that run effects from the sideboard to deal 1 damage or give creatures -1/-1. Nausea in black and Electrickery in red are a few examples of this. Penumbra Spider is some interesting deck tech that seems to be picked up by some of these deck lists now to help get a little extra game, or reach if you will, against decks that, like Delver, that are all in on the flying plan, that may not have as much raw power as Elves, but those decks are able to muck up the ground and tempo out just enough in the air to win the game. And the Penumbra Spider can certainly come in and make a big difference. Penumbra Spider is also particularly helpful against any deck that's chock full of 2/2 aggressive creatures. something like Elves where they attack in with a 2/2, you block with Penumbra Spider, they have to bolt it, they lose their elf, they lose their bolt, and you still flip your Penumbra Spider to have another 2/4. And then they have to attack with another 2/2, and they have to mutagenic growth their goblin, and the next thing you know, you got a 4-for-1 out of your Penumbra Spider. So in addition to being fairly decent against tempo style flying decks, it's also pretty good against aggressive decks that are filled with 2/2 creatures. So that's Elves. I want to take a minute now to just kind of talk about generally, because I don't want this video to go too long, I'm just trying to give you a sense of some of the things to keep in mind. I'm just going to walk through some of the things you've got to watch out for in various matchups. Against Affinity, Gleeful Sabotage is basically huge. Affinity is very reliant on artifact lands, and if you're able to pop a Gleeful Sabotage and blow up 2 of their lands early, sometimes that can give you, if you look at this deck list, this stock Affinity list is running 16 lands. There are some out there that run between 18 and 20 on the heavier side, but being able to blow up 2 lands for a deck that's only running 16 can be devastating in the early game. If they happen to be flooded with land, that could backfire on you. Another line of play you can go after if they happen to deploy an early Myr Enforcer, killing a Myr Enforcer in a land, or killing a Myr Enforcer in a Frogmite, or just blowing up some land. These are all great plays that allow you to get some sweet 2-for-1s. Additionally, one of the things that Affinity is looking to do is to take an ATOG and fling it at you or Temur Battle Rage. Being able to have the Moment's Peace against Temur Battle Rage is quite nice off the board along with the Gleeful Sabotages. It allows you the opportunity, should they sacrifice a lot of artifacts to the ATOG, they Alpha Strike with Temur Battle Rage. If you're able to get a Fog effect in, that can almost win the game right there if they've gone all in sacrificing their permanents for that Alpha Strike. Against Fling, there's really not much you can do other than try to gain enough life with Well-Wishers perhaps so that you get out of the range of them throwing a Fling at your face. You want to be aggressive, you have to accept that they're going to Galvanic Blast off some of your best creatures that you deploy, but you just want to keep a firm eye on the whole situation in the game. You want to be able to apply pressure, but you don't want to needlessly lose any of your creatures that you don't have to, which means occasionally not always attacking just because you have an opening. If you've got 4 elves and they have 1 blocker, even if you can jam through 3 or 4 points of damage, but you're going to lose an elf, it might not be worth it if you can build up a more powerful position and Alpha Strike them. And this is typically true for any matchup. However, the key to Affinity is sometimes you'll have to play a little more aggressively than you would in some matchups, because if you're sitting around 20 life and the game goes long and they hit Fling and ATOG, even though you have a dominant board state, that's really not going to matter. So even though typically Elves doesn't want to sacrifice too many elves for aggression, you might have to push that balance a little bit harder against Affinity. Also, against Burn, while at face value it might seem like Elves has an easy matchup here, it really doesn't. Because most of your life gaining effects Burn can deal with immediately so that you get nominal to 0 life gain. Also, with things like Martyr of Ashes and Electrickery, Burn is able to wipe your board in a number of ways. So it's going to be very important, even before you get to your second game, to have in mind that you're going to need to board in some amount of Spider Silk Armors. I would also mention a card not listed here, Magnify for 1 green, giving your whole team +1/+1, is an interesting trick because your opponent might commit an Electrickery thinking they're going to wipe your board, and for a single mana, you can actually save your whole team. So it's also a card that if you have out 6 elves, you give them all +1/+1, it's doubling the damage you can do on an Alpha Strike. So Magnify is a card that also shows up in some sideboards from time to time. Against Tron, it's really just a matter of racing in and trying to get in every point of damage as quickly as possible. Of course, this requires doing the careful calculus of deciding how to maximize your damage in terms of attacks each turn versus delaying some attacks to deploy more creatures to get an even bigger attack the next turn. At any rate, you mostly just want to strike in as much as you can, because if the Tron deck ever is able to establish a dominant position, the deck can completely lock you out. The deck can cast Moment's Peace, and then get Moment's Peace back with Mnemonic Wall, and then use Ghostly Flicker to flicker the Mnemonic Wall, and then return Moment's Peace, and keep doing shenanigans like this to just continually lock you out. And if the deck has red in it, it's most likely going to have Rolling Thunder in the main, or at least Electrickery in the sideboard. Either way, you've got to get in there and win quickly, or else. There is a lot of graveyard shenanigans that this type of deck is going to want to take advantage of, so utilizing a Relic of Progenitus out of your sideboard is also going to be helpful. Izzet Delver is a deck where it's trying to play a tempo game. The deck really comes down to how efficiently the deck is able to utilize its Spellstutter Sprite to counterspell your Elves, and if the deck is able to do something like counterspell one of your 1/1 Elves with a Spellstutter Sprite, attack with the Spellstutter Sprite, deploy of the Ninja of the Deep Hours, draw a card, return the Spellstutter Sprite, and then redeploy the Spellstutter Sprite to again counterspell one of your Elves, this means that you're pretty much most likely going to lose that game. So you want to play around things like Spellstutter Sprite, and you got to be very careful about Ninja. You're probably going to have enough things on the ground most likely to muck up the board against Ninja. You want to be careful to play around Spellstutter Sprite, but because you're playing as the tempo deck, this doesn't mean you can just sit back forever without trying to get creatures deployed and apply pressure, because if you wait too long, the tempo advantage will get ahead of you and you won't have a chance. Ideally, you want to be able to deploy multiple creatures every turn, so that if something does get counterspelled, at least you can get something through on the board. If your opponent only has 1 mana open, then you can feel free to cast whatever you believe you need to get on the board the most. In a situation where you know they can counterspell something, leading with a weaker card to try to bait out a counterspell is often a fairly typical, sturdy strategy. Looking at the sideboard, Penumbra Spider is very good here. Spider Silk Armor is good because they're probably going to board in Electrickery. Also, having access to additional Viridian Longbows in the sideboard is always nice. Also, let's take a look at maybe just a couple of other lists to see if we can maybe find a list that has a little bit more sideboard preparation. Here we go, Scattershot Archers. This is a sideboard that's definitely more prepared to face red-blue tempo with Delver. We've got an extra Viridian Longbow in the sideboard. There's also 2 Scattershot Archers in the sideboard. And again, combining a Scattershot Archer with a Quirion Ranger means that you're going to be able to untap your Scattershot Archer and activate it again. So you'll be able to effectively kill a flyer with 2 toughness rather than just 1, just by virtue of having an active Scattershot Archer and a Quirion Ranger. Or really, any creature with a Viridian Longbow attached and a Quirion Ranger. So that's just something to think about as far as additional defensive options against Izzet Delver, and generally the same principles are going to apply against Mono Blue Delver. The only real difference with Izzet Delver that you have to keep in mind is it typically has a copy of, by it I mean Izzet Delver, typically has a copy of Swirling Sandstorm in the sideboard. So that's a board wiper that you have to keep an eye out. Also, red-blue has access to Electrickery, whereas mono-blue does not. Other than that, you've got Lightning Bolt and you've got Scred. So the red-blue version is going to be able to actually blow your creatures up instead of just bouncing them back to your hand and trying to counterspell them. Next up, Kuldotha Kuldotha is going to try to blow up your creatures with Galvanic Blast, Lightning Bolt, and perhaps after sideboard, not perhaps, I would say more likely than not, you're going to be facing Electrickery and maybe even Clan Shaman, although that's not necessarily an inclusion in every version. But anytime you're playing against a red-white deck that is artifact based, even if it doesn't actually run the namesake Kuldotha Rebirth, you just have to know that a lot of your elves are going to get blown up. So this means if you have effects that can be utilized in response to burn on your creatures, that's going to be good. We don't really see a lot in this stock versions Sideboard, the most we see is Spider Silk Armor, but even having a Spider Silk Armor down isn't really going to do a whole lot against 3 or 4 points of burn incoming on a 1/1 or 2/2 creature unless you get multiples out. Penumbra Spider's not bad here, just because the bolts don't do anything, and if they have to use 2 burn spells to kill off your spider, that's pretty good. Let's take a look at a few other decks. Here we go. Magnify. Again, just getting the +1/+1's not necessarily going to do a whole lot, but we do have Wrap and Vigor. Here's an example of a defensive card oriented at providing a little extra range against various burn effects, including Electrickery. Mostly your goal is just going to have to be to power out Elves, keep the pressure on, hope that you can deploy enough of a presence, and use the Lead the Stampedes and maybe even Distant Melody to keep up enough pressure to outrun the control elements that they have in their deck. Also, it's worth mentioning that Koldatha Boros, perhaps one of the more important things to keep in mind here, is that there is another version of this deck that tries to operate by killing all your creatures and then trying to deploy Palace Sentinels to get the Monarch token so it draws an extra card at the end of every turn. If you can deal combat damage to them, you'll be able to take the Monarch token and then you'll be able to draw extra cards. So against that matchup, it's extra important to be able to jam some damage through. Next up, let's talk about mono black control. Probably the biggest things to talk about here is you need to be mindful that there's Crypt Rats, and if you overcommit your team, Crypt Rats can blow up your whole team. Also, Pestilence can blow up your whole team. Also, you have to keep an eye out for Nausea. Nausea gives -1/-1 until end of turn to all creatures. So I'm moving through this kind of quickly. So Pestilence does 1 damage to each creature and player, and Crypt Rats also can do X damage to each creature and each player, but you can only spend black mana. But it's fairly easily for an opponent to use these cards to kill a massive amount of your creatures. The difficult balance is if you hold your creatures back and deploy them slowly to avoid getting blown out by a sweeper, then your opponent has more than enough removal to take care of a few creatures at a time, between things like Chainer's Edict, Geth's Verdict, Victim of Night, Tendrils of Corruption, and additional spot removal that typically comes out of the sideboard like Unmake or Doomblade. If you deploy your creatures quickly, again, you're looking at a situation where a sweeper could kill them all. It's a very difficult situation, and to complicate matters further, the deck runs Kumbaj Witches, usually some combination of those in the main and sometimes even the sideboard as well. And Kumbaj Witches deal 1 damage to target creature or player, and 1 damage to target creature or player of an opponent's choice. How this works out in practice is they're able to blow up one of your elves, and in response, you can do 1 damage to them, which is a pretty bad trade for you, unless you've got them nearly dead. But the problem is, if they manage to stabilize even at a relatively low life total, and you think they're about to have their Kumbaj Witches shut down because they'll kill themselves with activations, well, the next thing you know, they'll deploy a Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which allows them to gain life, or Tendrils of Corruption to also gain life. The Merchant also deals damage to you, and the Tendrils can also kill one of your creatures. But the most important aspect of what these cards do is they allow the deck to top off their life total again to carry on their merry way, blowing up your creatures with Kumbaj Witches, or Crypt Rats, or Pestilence. As you can see, particularly once you board in additional things like Nausea and Unmake, and I'm not even sure if they would bring Unmake in, but they would definitely bring the Nauseas in, and they might bring Unmake in, just depending on their particular view of the matchup. This is not really a great matchup for Elves. However, this isn't something to really worry about too much, because, as you can see, Mono Black is about 4.4% of the metagame. Honestly, I don't think Mono Black is very good right now because it's a mid-range deck that loses to a lot of other mid-range decks. If you pilot the deck perfectly, you might be able to do okay with this deck, but it's not exactly a fringe deck, but it's definitely tier 2, maybe even tier 3. So while you don't have a great matchup against mono black, it occupies a small enough space in the metagame that you probably won't have to face it too much. And even if you run into it, maybe you can get a fast start and blow out some mono black decks from time to time. We also have inside out combo. One of the key things to remember is that they're going to try to combo you out with Tireless Tribe. So again, having a fog effect is very important. Tireless Tribe says discard a card from your hand. Tireless Tribe gets +0/+4 until end of turn. So Tireless Tribe allows you to chunk your hand to add a lot of toughness to Tireless Tribe. However, the deck also uses Inside Out to switch target creature's power and toughness until end of turn. So you get a Tireless Tribe and you play a Gush, which allows you to draw 2 cards and put 2 islands in your hand. And then maybe if you had one other card, you are now able to chunk 5 cards, which adds 20 toughness to Tireless Tribe. And then you play Inside Out to go to the dome for the win. So the fog effect is important. Also, gaining life is important. If you're able to get up 40, 50, 60 life, which is really not that hard with Well-Wisher, you can actually just get out of range of what Tireless Tribe can do a lot of the times. These lists sometimes run things like Delver. Seeker of the Way has been making a little bit of headway. So there are some other threats you have to keep an eyeball on. But basically, you're just going to have to try to apply enough pressure against Tireless Tribe to be able to get there. Some things to keep in mind. You're probably going to try to get your Viridian Longbow attached to one of your creatures, maybe even board in another Viridian Longbow. This allows you to tap to deal a point of damage to Tireless Tribe. They can always just discard a card and avoid Tireless Tribe dying by picking up extra toughness. If you wait until Tireless Tribe attacks you and they use Inside Out to switch its power and toughness, its toughness will go to 1 while it has a lot of power and you can ping it off the board. However, a lot of the time, the people that are running this deck understand some of the ins and outs and nuances, and so they'll try to counterspell with perhaps Circular Logic your Viridian Longbow when it comes down, or they'll try to gut shot whatever creature you've managed to attach your Viridian Longbow to. Some of these decks even run things like Gigadrouse, which allows them to tap your creature at the end of your turn. So these are some other back and forth play things to keep an eye on. But nonetheless, Viridian Longbow is still a particularly good option if you've got a Quirion Ranger in play, even if they manage to tap down whatever creature you've attached your Viridian Longbow to. A Quirion Ranger can allow you to just untap the creature anyway. So these are some of the back and forth things to keep an eye on. The Well-Wishers are fairly good in the matchup just because if you gain enough life, you can eventually have some chance of outrunning their maximum life gain. And if you can keep a couple of mana open and they don't Gigadrouse your lands down, Moment's Peace, which allows you to prevent all combat damage, if they empty their whole hand on an Alpha Strike, being able to get a fog effect off can be devastating against your opponent. So these are some other things. One of the last things that I'll mention about the matchup is that the deck also does run Circular Logic, which is a counterspell that counters target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard. And because it has Madness, it can be played for 1 blue mana by simply discarding it to a Tireless Tribe. So one of the other things you can do is you can board in Relic of Progenitus to eat their graveyard and nullify the functionality of Circular Logic. But this depends on how important you think stopping Circular Logic is versus the overall consistency of your aggressive plan to just simply try to apply enough pressure to kill the Tireless Tribe player before they can really enact their plan. Moving right along, let's talk about Stompy. Stompy is a pretty straightforward aggressive deck. You're going to see him try to take a Solana Ledgewalker and throw an Elephant Guide or a Rancor on it, or a Vault Scourge and throw a Rancor or an Elephant Guide on it, and utilize one of these strategies to go over the top. Also, the deck can have some very explosive starts where it'll play multiple Burning Tree Emissaries and maybe a Nest Invader on turn 2, and then the Nest Invader might sacrifice its token to enable Hunger of the Howlpack to put 3 +1/+1 counters on one of its creatures. And you could be looking at a lot of damage on turn 3, and the deck certainly can have reasonable consistency in killing you on turn 4 if you don't interact with the deck and just take all the damage. So what you want to do is basically try to build up the ability to uh, go long against the aggro deck. You can Alpha Strike them out, but more likely than not, between Essence Warden, Well-Wishers, Timberwatch Elves, you're trying to build enough power on your side of the equation where if they attack in, you can start killing off some of their creatures without losing any of yours. And if you can keep gaining life with Well-Wisher and perhaps get a Listline Huntmaster down and generate 1/1 tokens and do these kinds of things, or get an Elvish Vanguard down and just keep growing it, your deck has the ability as Elves to go over the top and you'll win the long game because your effects get so much more powerful as the game progresses. Your deck has very powerful synergies, whereas Stompy is just a very consistent, aggressive deck that can have very explosive starts. But if you can push the game long, generally you're going to be able to win the long matchup. Of course, Stompy knows that, at least any capable pilot will know, and so they're going to be trying to Alpha Strike you out. You want to kind of walk the delicate balance of preserving enough of your elves to start being able to get synergistic benefits with your elf cards versus simply trying to keep them from killing you, which is a very real threat. They're going to play things like Gut Shot to kill some of your elves, along with Epic Confrontation. Those are basically the things you have to know, is that even though Stompy's a mono green deck, they will have spot removal against some of your elves. One of the things I would say is Well-Wisher is pretty good in the matchup, even though they can spot removal it off. If you present a lot of different targets that must be killed, like Well-Wisher, Elvish Vanguard, Listline Huntmaster, and Timberwatch Elf, they're not going to have enough removal to kill everything. Essence Warden is definitely decent in the matchup, and they can't stop Mob Justice, although the problem is if you have to block and trade creatures early on, you may never get enough of a critical mass with Mob Justice to win, and if you're able to accumulate enough of a critical mass of creatures that Mob Justice is effective, you're probably winning that game anyway. So in this matchup, while they can't stop Mob Justice, I tend to view it as a win more card. Moment's Peace is an interesting card that's not going to win you the game per se because they commit all their resources to one Alpha Strike, but it might help you buy enough time to get where you need to go. Penumbra Spider is also not bad in the matchup. Spider Silk Armor is okay, but just adding 1 toughness isn't necessarily going to make a huge difference. So these are some things. Viridian Longbow in both your deck and their deck are huge. The ability to deploy a Viridian Longbow and start pinging off their creatures, particularly by utilizing Quirion Ranger or Nettle Sentinel multiple untap and ping effects to kill 2/2 creatures, is extremely strong. One thing you just have to be careful about when you're playing against Stompy is if you kill one of their creatures, it's going to open up the possibility for them to have Hunger of the Howlpack, have Morbid open to put 3+1/+1 counters on a creature. Is it Blitz? Kind of already talked a little bit about. Mono black or blue black control strategies play out the same in terms of you're trying to kill them as fast as you can, except blue black strategies tend typically to have less mass removal than mono black strategies. Now these decks can definitely still have board sweepers, they can still run Crypt Rats, they can still run Shrivel. They don't typically run Pestilence, but they do have other sweepers that they can deploy. So you have to be a little bit careful, but you definitely want to be a bit more aggressive against a blue-black deck than a mono-black deck, because you just have to get in there and win. Against a white deck, you have a more powerful long plan than they have. If you're playing against an enchantments-based white deck, which is what this one is, then you're definitely going to want to bring in your Gleeful Sabotage and possibly also a Fog Effect, and just try to gain as much life as you can and go big. Again, you'll definitely win the long game if you can get there. Boggles just comes down to getting your Gleeful Sabotages in there to do some work. Also, Natural State is a card that you can put into your sideboard. Right now, Boggles doesn't occupy a huge part of the metagame at just around 3%. There's so many Cruel Edicts, Chainer's Edicts running around out there, and a lot of Edict effects in general, that an all-in enchantments-based hexproof strategy is not the strongest right now. But if this deck ever does get out of control, you can always add extra copies of Natural State to your sideboard in addition to Gleeful Sabotage. Natural State also kills lands in the Affinity deck. One thing to keep in mind is this deck also, like Mono Green, can have things like Gut Shot and Epic Confrontation come out of the sideboard, as well as also having Cartouche of Strength as an option in the main or sideboard. So even though you're up against a white-green deck, don't think that means that they can't kill your creatures, because they can. Well, we covered a lot. It took us 35 minutes, but you got a full breakdown of Elves along with talking about some of the matchups. Right now, I want to take just a bit, though, to talk about where it's standing in the metagame. Elves is very good. However, Elves does have some susceptibility when it goes up against things like Mono Black, Kodatha Boros, Mono Blue Delver is kind of a tricky matchup. Izzet Delver is also a tricky matchup. And Burn's not great. Affinity, if you can get your Gleeful Sabotage, this should be a pretty good matchup for you. If you don't draw them, well, it's going to be a little trickier. So I think Elves is very powerful, very explosive. Because there's so many decks in the tier 1 area that have access to red for Elect Trickery, or Crypt Rats or Pestilence, there's just a lot of ways to blow up your whole crew. So one of the things I'm not sure is, I don't know if Elves is positioned right now this highly in the metagame because with Lead the Stampede, Elves really is one of the top 3 decks in the meta, or if it's just with Lead the Stampede coming out, a lot of people are trying it out. And when you have a lot of people jamming a deck, and it's an otherwise pretty good deck, you're going to see some skewed results in terms of how much the deck is showing up 5-0ing in leagues. So I don't know, it may be a little bit of both. I think Elves is good. It's actually not a deck that I would say is the second best deck out there. I think there's just so much hate. It's really good and explosive, but it is a deck that can get shut down. Same really goes for Affinity, but we'll talk about it next week. So I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. I know we moved kind of fast. Please feel free to leave comments. If you found this at all helpful, please subscribe if you want to get updates when the next episode comes out, which should be sometime within about a week. Then feel free to ring the bell so you'll get a notification on that. And stay tuned as we break down more decks in the Pauper meta.